Marcella Claxton. In the early hours of May 9th, 1976, a 20-year-old woman was walking home through the Chapeltown area of Leeds, England, when a man in a car pulled up beside her and offered her a lift. She got in. What she did not know was that the man behind the wheel would go on to become one of the most notorious serial killers in British history, and that within the next hour she would become one of the very small number of people who ever survived an encounter with him. Marcella Claxton was 20 years old, living in a back-to-back terraced house off Roundhay Road in Leeds. She had spent the evening at a local club and was making her way home on foot when the driver pulled alongside her. According to later reports, she was also 4 months pregnant at the time, though this was a detail that police would fail to take seriously in the days that followed. That single ride would change the course of her life. The driver was Peter Sutcliffe, a lorry driver from Bradford who would later be known around the world as the Yorkshire Ripper. He offered Marcella a lift and then drove her a short distance to Roundhay Park, a quiet stretch of green space on the edge of the city. When she stepped out of the car, he came up behind her and struck her over the head with a ball-peen hammer. He hit her repeatedly, opening 8 separate wounds in her skull, and then walked away, believing she was dead. But Marcella was not dead. Bleeding heavily and barely able to see, she pulled herself upright and then began crawling across the wet grass toward the road. She managed to reach a public telephone box at the edge of the park and used it to call for an ambulance, saving her own life. When she reached the hospital, doctors closed the wounds in her head with 52 stitches. She had survived a direct hammer attack from a man who would go on to take the lives of 13 women. She had also seen his face. When detectives came to speak with her, she gave them a clear description of a white man with a beard, along with details of the car and the direction in which he had driven. It was, in retrospect, a description of Sutcliffe himself. But the investigating officers dismissed her account. At the time, they were working under the belief that the killer they were hunting was a man with a northeastern accent, based on a hoax tape sent to them by someone falsely claiming responsibility for the murders. Because Marcella's description did not fit their assumptions, her attack was set aside and not treated as part of the Ripper series. The killings continued for another 5 years. What would it take for the police to finally connect the pieces? In the end, it was not detective work, but a routine traffic stop. On January 2nd, 1981, Sutcliffe was pulled over in Sheffield for driving with false number plates. Within days, he had confessed to 13 murders and 7 attempted murders. At his Old Bailey trial that May, he pleaded not guilty to the murder charges on grounds of diminished responsibility, but the jury rejected the argument by a majority of 10-2. He was convicted of murder and given 20 concurrent life sentences, with a recommended minimum term of 30 years behind bars. The recommendation was later formalized into something far more permanent. In 2010, the High Court imposed a whole-life order on Sutcliffe, meaning he would remain in custody for the rest of his natural life with no possibility of release. For Marcella, the news came almost 35 years after the attack that had left her with lasting headaches, dizzy spells, and blackouts. In 1981, she was awarded a criminal injuries payment of around £17,500, following an appeal by her solicitor, after the Compensation Board had initially refused her claim on the grounds that she had somehow provoked the attack. As of 2026, Peter Sutcliffe is dead. He died in custody on November 13th, 2020, at the age of 74, after refusing treatment for a series of illnesses that included complications from COVID-19. Marcella Claxton is alive. She has spoken publicly in later documentaries about the attack and about the years of dismissal that followed it. and she remains one of the very small number of women who ever looked Peter Sutcliffe in the face and walked away. The next survivor was left in a condition no doctor would have expected anyone to live through. She was found alive in the bush outside a South African coastal city, holding her own throat closed with one hand and her own body together with the other. Alison Botha. On the night of December 18, 1994, a 27-year-old insurance broker pulled her car up to her flat in the South African city of Port Elizabeth and stepped out to head inside. Within seconds, she was at knife point. Within the hour, she was lying in the bush outside the city with her throat cut and her stomach opened. And yet, by the end of that same night, the two men who had done it were already being hunted because she had refused to die. Alison Botha was 27 years old, working as an insurance broker in the coastal city then known as Port Elizabeth. She had been head girl at Collegiate High School for girls and lived in her own flat, independent and settled in her career. To the people who knew her, she was capable, grounded, and self-possessed. There was nothing in her life that would have suggested what was about to happen to her. As Alison stepped out of her car that night, a man named Franz Dutoit was waiting for her. He forced his way into the passenger seat at knife point, ordered her to drive, and then had her stop to pick up his accomplice, Theuns Kruger. The two men directed her out of the city and into an area of bushland near Noordhoek. There they raped her, stabbed her in the abdomen more than 30 times, and cut her throat, leaving her nearly decapitated. Believing they had finished her, they left her lying in the dirt and drove off in her own car. What happened next has been documented in her own words in every year since. Alison regained consciousness alone in the bush. Her throat had been cut deeply enough that she had to hold her head up with her hands to keep her airway open. And her abdomen had been opened so severely that she had to hold her own insides in place as she moved. In this condition, she crawled through the darkness until she reached the edge of the road. There, a passing motorist named Tian Eilard saw her, stopped, and got her to a hospital. Doctors, against every expectation, saved her life. From her hospital bed, once she was stable enough to speak, Alison identified both of her attackers by picking them out of police photographs. Franz Dutoit and Theuns Kruger were arrested within days. Both men, as it turned out, had already been out on bail at the time of the attack, facing earlier rape charges. The evidence against them, including Alison's own identification, was overwhelming. What kind of sentence do you hand two men who left a woman for dead in that condition? In 1995, both men were tried in the Port Elizabeth High Court. They pleaded guilty to a series of charges that included kidnapping, rape, and attempted murder. The judge sentenced each of them to life imprisonment, and for close to 3 decades, that was where the case stood. Then, in July of 2023, both Dutoit and Kruger were quietly released on parole after serving 28 and 29 years respectively. Alison was not notified in advance. When news of the release became public, the reaction across South Africa was immediate. Survivor groups, women's advocacy organizations, and members of the public campaigned for the decision to be reversed. In February of 2025, the Correctional Services Minister revoked the parole of both men, and both were returned to prison. As of 2026, Franz Dutoit and Theuns Kruger are once again incarcerated. Alison Botha is alive. She has since raised 2 sons, despite injuries that had been intended to leave her incapable of ever having children. She is the author of a best-selling memoir titled I Have Life, and her story was made into a full-length documentary film released in 2016. In September of 2024, she suffered a brain aneurysm and has faced ongoing health complications, partially covered by a trust set up in her name. She continues, when her health allows, to speak internationally as one of South Africa's most well-known advocates for survivors of gender-based violence, having addressed audiences in more than 20 countries. The next survivor did not have decades between her attack and the arrest of the man who tried to kill her. In her case, the man was still on the other side of a locked motel room door while she was already on the phone with the police. Tiffany Taylor. In the summer of 2016, a 20-year-old woman in New Jersey met a man through a social app called Tagged and agreed to see him at a motel. Within an hour of getting into his car, she was handcuffed, gagged, and being strangled to the point of unconsciousness. She survived. And the reason she survived was that she outthought the man attacking her in real time, using nothing but her hands and a story about a phone she said she needed to go back and get. Tiffany Taylor was in her early 20s, living in the Essex County area of New Jersey. Her life at the time was unstable, and she had experienced periods of homelessness and involvement in sex work. She had met her attacker through a mutual acquaintance at a motel in Elizabeth, New Jersey, and she left with him in his car later that evening. She had no way of knowing that the young man she was riding with had already taken the lives of at least 2 other women. His name was Khalil Wheeler Weaver, and he had been using the Tagged app to identify and lure women in the area, most of whom, like Tiffany, were vulnerable in ways he had learned to spot. Once he had her in the car, he drove to a secluded spot, restrained her wrists behind her back with metal handcuffs, and covered her mouth with tape. He then raped her and began strangling her, choking her into unconsciousness more than once. Each time she came around, he continued. What Wheeler Weaver did not notice was that Tiffany had worked one of her hands free from the handcuffs. She kept the movement small and eventually loosened the tape covering her mouth as well. Rather than trying to fight her way out of a moving car in the middle of the night, she took a different approach. She told him she had left her phone back in the motel room and that she needed to go back and get it. He believed her. He drove her back to the motel and let her walk toward the room. Once she was inside, she locked the door, kept him out, and called 911. She then reported him to the Essex County Prosecutor's Office that same night. Here the story takes a difficult turn. Despite Tiffany's report, the response from investigators was slow. 1 week later, Wheeler Weaver took the life of a 19-year-old college student named Sarah Butler, whose family and friends did their own social media detective work to identify the man she had been messaging before her death. Once Wheeler Weaver was in custody, Tiffany's account of the method, the handcuffs, the tape, and the strangulation allowed prosecutors to link the murders together as the work of a single offender. What does justice look like when the victims might still be alive if the first survivor had been believed? The trial took place in Essex County in 2019. A jury convicted Wheeler Weaver of 3 counts of murder, along with kidnapping, aggravated sexual assault, the attempted murder of Tiffany Taylor, aggravated arson, and desecration of human remains. In October of 2021, Judge Mark S. Ali sentenced him to 160 years in prison. Under New Jersey's No Early Release Act, he must serve 145 of those years before he becomes eligible for parole. In March of 2022, prosecutors added a 4th murder charge to his record, connected to the death of a 15-year-old girl named Mawa Doumbia, whose body had been found in October of 2016. The additional charge was still working its way through the court system as of last reporting. As of 2026, Khalil Wheeler Weaver is incarcerated in a New Jersey state facility, and by any realistic reading of his sentence, he will die there. Tiffany Taylor spent a full day on the witness stand during his trial, giving the testimony that connected the pattern of the killings and telling the jury in her own words, that she did not want the court to show him the kind of remorse he had never shown her or anyone else. She remains the only person known to have gotten out of a car with Khalil Wheeler Weaver alive. The next survivor was not attacked by a stranger or by a serial killer. She was attacked in her own bedroom by a man her husband had paid $50,000 to make sure she never came home from work again. Susan Kuhnhausen. On the evening of September 6, 2006, a 51-year-old emergency room nurse walked into her house in southeast Portland, Oregon, after a long shift and found a stranger with a claw hammer waiting for her in her bedroom. She did not run. By the time she called for help, the intruder was dead on her hallway floor, and the trail he had left behind was about to reveal something far darker than a random home invasion. Susan Kuhnhausen was 51 years old and had worked as an emergency room nurse at Providence Portland Medical Center for close to 30 years. She had been married to her husband Michael for 18 years. Though the two had been estranged for some months and she had asked him to move out, she was physically strong, trained in self-defense, and used to keeping her composure in situations that would rattle almost anyone else. That evening, she arrived home to a note from her husband saying he had gone to the beach for the weekend. Waiting for her inside the house was a man named Edward Dalton Haffey, aged 59, a convicted felon with a long record. He had been paid $50,000 by her husband to end her life. Michael Kuhnhausen had let him into the house before leaving town. Haffey came at Susan with a claw hammer as she moved through the bedroom, striking her and trying to drive her to the floor. What Haffey had not counted on was that Susan spent her working life in an emergency room, where physical fights with agitated patients were routine, and where she had learned how to defend herself. She got hold of the hammer, wrenched it away from him, and turned it back on him. She bit him. She held on. Eventually, she got behind him and put him in a chokehold, holding it until he stopped moving. She then walked out of the house, still bleeding, and asked a neighbor to call 911. When the police arrived, Haffey was dead in her hallway. He had left behind a backpack. Inside it, investigators found her husband Michael's cell phone number and a daybook with a note reading "Call Mike," dated 2 days before the attack. The evidence pointed away from Susan and toward her husband almost immediately. Portland police concluded that she had killed Haffey in lawful self-defense under Oregon law, and she was never charged. Within days, detectives had established a paper trail connecting Michael Kuhnhausen to Haffey. Michael had paid a man he barely knew $50,000 to take out his own wife, believing he could stage her death as a violent burglary and walk away untouched. How do you sit across a table from a man you have been married to for 18 years, knowing he paid a stranger to make sure you never came home? In April of 2007, Michael Kuhnhausen was convicted of solicitation to commit murder. The court sentenced him to 10 years in an Oregon state prison. He attempted to appeal the conviction and lost that appeal in 2009. Every attempt to challenge the sentence went nowhere after that. As of 2026, Michael Kuhnhausen is dead. He died of natural causes while still serving his sentence in 2014. Edward Dalton Haffey, the man he had hired, had already died on the hallway floor the night of the attack. Susan Kuhnhausen legally changed her name to Susan Walters after the ordeal and has since become a public advocate for victims of violent crime. Her case was featured on the investigation discovery series Nothing Personal, Murder for Hire, and she continues to speak publicly about surviving a paid attempt on her life at the hands of the man she had once trusted most. The next survivor did not have the physical training of a career nurse. What she had was a bathroom door, one of the very first mobile phones ever carried by a private citizen in her city, and a dispatcher on the other end of the line who refused to let her hang up. Jennifer Morey. In the early hours of April 15, 1995, a 25-year-old attorney in Houston, Texas, woke up to the sound of a man moving inside her apartment. Within minutes, he had cut her throat and left her bleeding on the bathroom floor. She survived because she managed to reach one of the very first personal mobile phones in her city, and because the voice on the other end of that call refused to let her go, even as her attacker knocked on the door and pretended to be a rescuer. Jennifer Morey was 25 years old and working as an attorney in Houston. She had chosen her apartment complex, the Bayou Park Apartments on Memorial Drive, specifically because it was surrounded by an 8-foot fence and staffed with round-the-clock private security guards. She had wanted to live somewhere she felt safe. As it turned out, the person who came through her door that night was one of the guards. His name was Brian Wayne Gibson, and he was 26 years old, working the overnight shift for Pinkerton Security at her apartment complex. Sometime after midnight, he used his access to the property to enter her apartment. He sexually assaulted her and then took a knife to her throat and face, cutting her severely before he assumed she was going to bleed out. Jennifer, badly wounded, managed to get up and get herself into her bathroom, where she pushed the door shut and held it closed with her body. She pressed a wad of toilet paper against the cuts on her neck to slow the bleeding. Then she reached for something almost no private individual in 1995 owned. She had a personal mobile phone, and she used it to dial 911. The dispatcher on the line was a man named Richard Everett, and he stayed on the call with her without letting go. At one point, a knock came at the bathroom door. A man on the other side claimed to be there to help her. Richard Everett told her, in no uncertain terms, not to open it. The man at the door was Brian Gibson himself, still inside the apartment, pretending to be a rescuer. She did not open the door. When Houston police arrived and searched the scene, they found Gibson injured, bleeding from his own hand and missing his Pinkerton cap and his underwear. Both items turned up inside the apartment, covered in her blood. His story about an intruder fleeing across a wet field fell apart because there were no footprints in the grass outside. What do you do when the man paid to protect you is the man who came for you? On May 8, 1996, in the 232nd District Court of Harris County, Brian Wayne Gibson was convicted and sentenced to 20 years in the Texas Department of Criminal Justice. Media coverage of the case described the conviction as attempted murder, while the formal registration record with the Texas Department of Public Safety lists the offense as burglary of a habitation with intent to commit a sexual offense. The 20-year sentence itself was not in dispute. Gibson appealed the conviction to the Texas First Court of Appeals, which affirmed the ruling in December of 1997. The Texas Court of Criminal Appeals refused his petition for further review in April of 1998. A later state habeas petition was dismissed for noncompliance in 2004. Every attempt to overturn the conviction failed. As of 2026, Brian Wayne Gibson has served his full 20-year sentence. He was discharged, not paroled, in April of 2015. He is a lifetime registered sex offender in the state of Texas, most recently listed at an address in Montgomery County. Jennifer Morey sued Pinkerton Security in the years that followed the attack. And in September of 1998, the case was settled for an undisclosed sum. She has since built a career in family law in Fort Worth under the name Jennifer Morey Caldwell. She's married, has children, and remains in touch with the dispatcher who kept her on the phone that night. When she was married, Richard Everett was there at the wedding. Not subscribed yet? Now's the time. And if audio's more your thing, Find us on Spotify too. You can click the link in our bio. Callie Quinn. In the summer of 2011, a 23-year-old woman from Texas was living in a shared hostel in Santiago, Chile, teaching English and starting a new chapter of her life abroad. One of her housemates was a charismatic marathon runner with what seemed like a compelling backstory and a growing list of sponsors. What she did not know was that almost everything about him was a lie, and that within a matter of weeks, he would take her to an abandoned building on the edge of the city, try to end her life, and bury her body under a pile of debris on the floor. Then she would dig herself out. Callie Quinn was 23 years old, a University of Texas geography graduate from the small town of Canyon Lake, Texas. After finishing her degree, she had moved to Santiago to teach English and see something of the world. She lived in a shared hostel-style house with other travelers and expatriates. One of her housemates was a man calling himself a Palestinian marathon runner in search of sponsorships. His real name was Youssef Khater, a Danish citizen of Lebanese origin who was in the middle of running an elaborate fraud on nearly everyone he came into contact with. He borrowed money from housemates. He accepted sponsorships he had no intention of honoring. And by the summer of 2011, several of the debts were coming due, including one he owed to Callie. On the night of July 20th, 2011, Khater told Callie he wanted to pay her back what he owed her, and that he had something interesting he wanted to show her at an abandoned tire store on the edge of Santiago. She agreed to go with him. Once they were inside the empty building, he attacked her. He bludgeoned her over the head with a heavy metal object, strangled her until she lost consciousness, and buried her under a pile of ash and debris on the floor. He then walked out into the night, believing she was gone and that his debts had gone with her. At some point in the hours that followed, Callie regained consciousness in the dark. Bleeding, disoriented, and in serious pain, she dug herself out from under the pile of debris, pushed her way out of the abandoned building, and dragged her badly beaten body back through the streets of the city to the shared house. The next morning, Khater packed his bags and left the house, telling everyone his mother had died in Denmark and that he had to fly home immediately. Callie fought through the Chilean justice system with the help of a local attorney named Rocio Berrios, and Khater was tracked down and arrested in a sting operation. He initially denied any involvement, then admitted he had struck her over the head. What does it take to bring a man like this to a court of law in a country that is not your own? For Callie, the answer was months of pressure, testimony, and the slow grinding of a foreign legal system. The investigation also quickly established that she had not been Khater's only victim. On a separate occasion in Chile, he had attacked a British runner named Dominic Rayner on a hiking trail, cracking his skull open with a rock. He was later accused of trying to smother a Canadian woman in her sleep in Costa Rica. Khater is best understood not as a serial killer in the traditional sense, but as a serial con man and repeat attempted killer. A man who used charm and false identities to move between countries and leave a trail of victims behind him. He was convicted in Chile in 2012 of attempted murder and fraud. His sentence was roughly 600 days, and he ended up serving only a fraction of that time behind bars before being deported to Denmark, where he faced additional charges, was acquitted on 3 of them, and served only around 3 more months in custody. As of 2026, Youssef Khater is a free man. After his release, he resurfaced in Costa Rica in 2015 under a new name, was briefly arrested for fraud there in 2017, and again in Nicaragua in 2019, and was last confirmed in Denmark somewhere between 2018 and 2023. His current whereabouts are effectively unknown. Callie Quinn recovered from her injuries, was later diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder, moved home to Texas, and now works in healthcare. Her story was told in the Netflix docuseries Worst Roommate Ever, in an episode titled Marathon Man, which she narrated herself. The next survivor was not far from home when she was attacked. She was in her own city, riding in a car with a stranger, and the man behind the wheel would end up giving himself away with the sound of his own voice. Denise Williams. In August of 1982, a 19-year-old woman in Minneapolis, Minnesota, got into a car with a stranger. Within the hour, she had been stabbed more than a dozen times with a screwdriver and left for dead in a quiet stretch of the city. She survived because she reached for a glass bottle at her feet. And the man who attacked her, one of the most disturbing serial killers in Minnesota history, would end up caught not because a detective outsmarted him, but because he could not stop crying on the phone. Denise Williams was 19 years old and living in Minneapolis. At the time of the attack, she was engaged in sex work, which was how she came to be in the car with her attacker in the first place. Beyond that, the details of her personal life have been kept out of the wider public record, as is her right. What is on the record, and what will always be on the record, is what happened to her one night in the late summer of 1982. The man behind the wheel that night was Paul Michael Stephanie, a Minnesotan who had by then already committed multiple murders and had earned his own strange form of infamy in the local press. He was known to tearfully call the police after each of his attacks, weeping into the receiver about what he had done. Reporters and detectives had begun referring to him as the weepy-voiced killer. Denise had no reason to know that any of this was in the man beside her when she got into his car. On the night of August 21st, 1982, Stephanie drove her away from the downtown area and toward a dark, secluded stretch of the city. When she realized he was not heading back to where they had agreed to go, her instincts sharpened. Then he attacked her with a screwdriver, stabbing her more than a dozen times. She fought back. In the footwell of the car, she found an empty glass bottle. She grabbed it and swung it hard, striking Stephanie over the head and cutting his face open severely. Bleeding and startled, he lost control of the situation. Denise was able to scream and get herself out of the vehicle. A nearby resident heard the commotion and came out to intervene, and Denise was taken to a hospital. What Stephanie did next was what unraveled him. The wound to his face was serious enough that he needed medical help of his own, and he called for it. When dispatchers heard his high-pitched, distressed voice on the emergency line, they recognized it as the same voice they had been listening to on tape for months, weeping after each murder. It was the voice of the weepy-voiced killer, and it led them directly to him. How does a serial killer catch himself with the sound of his own voice? Stephanie was arrested and charged with the murder of a woman named Barbara Simons and the attempted murder of Denise Williams. He was convicted of both, and a Minnesota court sentenced him to 40 years for the murder and around 18 more years for the attempted murder. Combined with related charges, the total ran to well over 4 decades behind bars. He attempted to appeal without success. Years later, in 1997, Stephanie was diagnosed with terminal skin cancer. Facing the end of his life, he confessed to the killings of Kimberly Compton, Kathleen Greening, and Barbara Simons, as well as the attempted murders of Karen Potak and Denise Williams. He was linked, in total, to 3 murders and 2 attempted murders. As of 2026, Paul Michael Stephanie is dead. He died of cancer on June 12, 1998, at Oak Park Heights Prison in Minnesota. still serving his sentence. Denise Williams's own life after the attack has been kept largely out of the public eye. What is on the record is that she survived a direct attack from a confirmed serial killer, that she fought back with an empty bottle from the floor of his car, and that in doing so she handed investigators exactly what they needed to end his run. The next survivor did not fight off a stranger in a car in the dark. She stepped outside her own front door to say goodbye to a man she had once believed she loved. And she was stabbed 32 times before her feet ever left her own driveway. Melissa Dome. In the early hours of January 24, 2012, a 20-year-old nursing student in Clearwater, Florida, stepped outside her house to say goodbye to her ex-boyfriend, who had been calling her for months and begging for a single hug. When she reached out her arms to him, he pulled a switchblade from his pocket. By the time paramedics reached her, she had been stabbed 32 times. She flatlined more than once on the way to the hospital. And she survived. Melissa Dome was 20 years old, a nursing student who volunteered at a local hospital in her spare time. She was planning a trip to Europe. She had recently left an abusive relationship with a man named Robert Burton, and she had told him repeatedly that it was over. For months afterward, Burton continued to call her, showing up on her phone at all hours, asking to see her one last time and promising it would only be for a moment. In the early hours of that January morning, Melissa finally agreed to meet him outside her home. He asked her for a single hug goodbye. When she stepped forward to give it to him, he drew a switchblade and began stabbing her. In her own later accounts, she has said the injuries totaled 19 wounds to her head, neck, and face, along with 13 wounds to her hands and arms, sustained while she was trying to shield herself from the blade. He left her lying in the street, believing she was dead. 2 teenagers nearby heard her screaming, tried to intervene, and called 911. When the first responders arrived, Melissa was barely able to speak, but she was able to name her attacker. She gave them Robert Burton, and she gave them the correct spelling before losing consciousness. She flatlined multiple times in transit, received 12 units of blood, suffered a stroke in her cerebellum, and had multiple fractures to her skull, nose, and jaw. She underwent roughly 5 hours of emergency trauma surgery, and she lived. Burton was arrested a short time later after crashing his truck in what was described as an apparent suicide attempt. In August of 2013, he pleaded guilty to attempted first-degree murder. Judge Keith Meyer sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. What does it take to look at the man who nearly took your life and to speak the words that you no longer hold anything against him? That is what Melissa Dome eventually did. In the years that followed the attack, she publicly forgave Burton, describing the decision as one made for her own healing rather than for anything owed to him. It became one of the most talked about moments of her advocacy work, and drew both admiration and criticism from viewers who saw her speak about it. She went on to graduate summa cum laude in 2016. She began speaking around the country about surviving domestic violence, appearing on major networks and morning shows, including 48 Hours, 2020, Good Morning America, and The Today Show. There is one further piece of her story worth including. One of the paramedics who kept her alive on the way to the hospital that morning was a young man named Cameron Hill. In 2015, he proposed to her at a Tampa Bay Rays game. In 2017, they married. She now goes by Melissa Dome Hill. As of 2026, Robert Burton is still incarcerated in Florida, serving a life sentence with no possibility of parole. Melissa Dome Hill continues to work as the executive director of a domestic violence advocacy organization called Hands Across the Bay. And in 2024, she received a Nation of Neighbors Empowerment Award for that work. In an unrelated development, Robert Burton's own father was arrested some years later in connection with a cold case sexual assault, adding another disturbing layer to a story that had already changed one young woman's life forever. The next survivor was not stabbed in her own driveway. She was locked in the trunk of a stranger's car in the desert outside Palm Springs, California, with her hands tied behind her back and a machete-wielding driver up front. And she got out. Jennifer Asbenson. On the morning of September 27, 1992, a 19-year-old woman near Palm Springs, California, accepted a ride to her overnight nursing job from a man she had met the day before. She woke up in the trunk of his car, hands bound and half undressed, with a driver up front who had already decided she was not going to make it to morning. She got out of that trunk. She flagged down help. And 5 years later, she looked at his photograph and identified him without hesitation. Jennifer Asbenson was 19 years old, working the overnight shift at a residential home for disabled children near Palm Springs. She was a young woman with a difficult childhood behind her and a career in caregiving in front of her. The night before the attack, she had accepted a ride to work from a man she had just met, an ex-Marine named Andrew Urdiales. Not entirely trusting him, she had given him a fake phone number. The next morning, Urdiales was waiting for her when she came off shift. He offered her another ride home, and this time, once she was in the car, he pulled off the main road, enraged that the phone number she had given him had turned out to be false. He bound her hands, cut off her clothing, tried to rape her, bit her neck hard enough to draw blood, and strangled her until she lost consciousness. Then he locked her in the trunk of his car and got back behind the wheel. At some point during that drive, Jennifer regained consciousness in the dark. Working her hands loose from the ties that held them, she felt her way around the inside of the trunk until she found the release. She popped it open, dove out, and started running down the desert highway, half-clothed and bleeding. Urdiales stopped the car and came after her with a machete. She kept running. In one of the more improbable rescues in true crime, she was picked up by a passing truck carrying 2 United States Marines, who took her to safety. Urdiales was long gone by the time authorities responded, and a bulldozer that had been working in the area destroyed the tire tracks left by his vehicle. For 5 years, there was very little physical evidence to work with. Then, in 1997, police showed Jennifer a photo array. She picked Urdiales out of it immediately. Confronted, he confessed that she was the one who had gotten away. What kind of man tells detectives that a woman escaped him, and then explains, in effect, how many others did not? By the time he was in custody, investigators had linked Andrew Urdiales to at least 8 murders across California and Illinois. He was tried in Illinois in 2002 for the killings of 3 women and sentenced to death. When Illinois abolished the death penalty in 2011, his sentence was commuted to life. He was then extradited to California, tried in 2018 for the murders of 5 more women, and again sentenced to death on October 5th of that year. Jennifer testified against him in California, sitting in the same courtroom as the man who had once locked her in the trunk of a car in the middle of the desert. As of 2026, Andrew Urdiales is dead. He died by suicide on November 2, 2018, in the Adjustment Center at San Quentin State Prison. He was 54 years old. Jennifer Asbenson has since written a memoir about her attack and recovery, titled The Girl in the Treehouse. She lives in the Los Angeles area under the name Jennifer Asbenson Araten, speaks publicly as a trauma survivor and advocate, and was featured in a 48 Hours episode and in an A&E documentary about the case, titled I Survived a Serial Killer, Desert Demon. She is the only known survivor of a man who took the lives of at least 8 women, and she was, in the end, one of the people whose testimony helped bring him to a courtroom to answer for those killings. The last survivor on this list did not have 5 years between her attack and the man behind it being caught. She had one train, one drifter, and a shattered jaw. And she would become the single witness who put the railroad killer on death row. Holly Dunn. On the night of August 28, 1997, a 20-year-old college student and her boyfriend were walking along a set of railroad tracks in Lexington, Kentucky, after a party. Out of the darkness, a man came at them. Her boyfriend did not survive. She did, and in doing so, she became the only person known to have walked away from a serial killer believed to have taken the lives of as many as 23 people across the American railway system. Holly Dunn was 20 years old, a junior at the University of Kentucky, originally from Evansville, Indiana. She was on a date with her boyfriend, a young man named Christopher Meyer, and the two of them had taken a walk along the railroad tracks near their college town after a party. It was the kind of casual, ordinary night that neither of them had reason to think would end in violence. The man who came out of the dark that night was Angel Maturino Resendiz, a Mexican drifter who traveled the United States by freight train. Federal investigators would later describe him as one of the most elusive serial offenders in modern American history. He attacked Christopher first, ending his life at the scene. He then turned his attention to Holly. He raped her, beat her, and stabbed her, leaving her with a shattered jaw, a fractured eye socket, and multiple deep lacerations to her head and body. Before he left, he bound her hands with her own belt and tied her feet as well. Resendiz walked away certain that both of his victims were dead. What he did not know was that Holly, though catastrophically injured, was still alive and still conscious enough to work at the belt around her wrists. She got her hands free. Then she got her feet free. Then, barefoot, she walked across a stretch of railroad and broken glass until she reached a house and got someone to open the door. She survived a shattered jaw that had to be wired shut for a month, along with every other injury he had left her with. She became the key witness. Resendiz was linked to at least 15 murders, and investigators suspect the true number is closer to 23, spread across Texas, Kentucky, Illinois, and other states. Holly was his only known survivor. In the years that followed, she gave detectives everything she could recall about the man, about his appearance, and about the night in Kentucky. What does it take to sit in a courtroom and describe, in front of him, the night you were not supposed to survive? Resendiz was placed on the FBI's 10 Most Wanted list and surrendered himself on July 13, 1999, at the encouragement of his sister and a Texas Ranger. He was tried in Texas for the murder of a Houston research doctor named Claudia Benton, convicted of capital murder, and sentenced to death on May 22, 2000. Holly Dunn testified during the penalty phase of that trial. Mexico's government sought clemency for him, and a Houston judge later ruled him mentally competent to be executed after further review in June of 2006. He was executed by lethal injection on June 27, 2006. As of 2026, Angel Maturino Resendiz is long dead. Holly Dunn, who now goes by Holly Dunn Pendleton, has since built a life defined by what she did with her survival, rather than by what was done to her. She authored a memoir titled Sole Survivor, describing both the night of the attack and the years of recovery that followed. She founded a victim advocacy center in her hometown of Evansville, Indiana, called Holly's House, which opened its doors on September 2, 2008, and which continues to serve victims of violent and sexual crimes to this day. She received the 2006 Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis Award for her work in survivor advocacy, and she continues to speak nationally on the subject. Her story has been featured on 48 Hours and on People magazine Investigates. She remains the only person known to have looked into the eyes of the railroad killer and walked away. This was all from our side today. Thanks for watching. Click here to check out another video.